Part 2. Re-encounter. Chapter 1. Such were Irene Redfield's memories as she sat there in her room, a flood of October sunlight streaming in upon her, holding that second letter of Clare Kendry's. Laying it aside, she regarded with an astonishment that had in it a mild degree of amusement the violence of the feelings which it stirred in her. It wasn't the great measure of anger that surprised and slightly amused her. That, she was certain, was justified and reasonable, as was the fact that it could hold, still strong and unabated, across the stretch of 2 years' time, entirely removed from any sight or sound of John Bellew or of Clare. That even at this remote date the memory of the man's words and manner had power to set her hands to trembling and to send the blood pounding against her temples did not seem to her extraordinary. But that she should retain that dim sense of fear, of panic, was surprising, silly. That Clare should have written, should, even all things considered, have expressed a desire to see her again, did not so much amaze her. To count as nothing the annoyances, the bitterness, or the suffering of others, that was Clare. Well, Irene's shoulders went up. One thing was sure, that she needn't, and didn't intend to, lay herself open to any repetition of a humiliation as galling and outrageous as that which, for Clare Kendry's sake, she had borne that time in Chicago. Once was enough. If, at the time of choosing, Clare hadn't precisely reckoned the cost, she had nevertheless no right to expect others to help make up the reckoning. The trouble with Clare was, not only that she wanted to have her cake and eat it too, but that she wanted to nibble at the cakes of other folk as well. Irene Redfield found it hard to sympathize with this new tenderness, this avowed yearning of Clare's for "my own people." The letter which she just put out of her hand was, to her taste, a bit too lavish in its wordiness, a shade too unreserved in the manner of its expression. It roused again that old suspicion that Clare was acting, not consciously perhaps, that is, not too consciously, but none the less acting. Nor was Irene inclined to excuse what she termed Clare's downright selfishness. And mingled with her disbelief and resentment was another feeling, a question. Why hadn't she spoken that day? Why, in the face of Bellew's ignorant hate and aversion, had she concealed her own origin? Why had she allowed him to make his assertions and express his misconceptions undisputed? Why, simply because of Clare Kendry, who had exposed her to such torment, had she failed to take up the defence of the race to which she belonged? Irene asked these questions, felt them. They were, however, merely rhetorical, as she herself was well aware. She knew their answers, every one, and it was the same for them all. The sardony of it! She couldn't betray Clare, even run the risk of appearing to defend a people that were being maligned, for fear that that defence might in some infinitesimal degree lead the way to final discovery of her secret. She had to Clare Kendry a duty. She was bound to her by those very ties of race which, for all her repudiation of them, Clare had been unable to completely sever. And it wasn't, as Irene knew, that Clare cared at all about the race or what was to become of it. She didn't. Or that she had for any of its members great, or even real, affection, though she professed undying gratitude for the small kindnesses which the Westover family had shown her when she was a child. Irene doubted the genuineness of it, seeing herself only as a means to an end where Clare was concerned. Nor could it be said that she had even the slight artistic or sociological interest in the race that some members of other races displayed. She hadn't. No, Clare Kendry cared nothing for the race. She only belonged to it. "Not another damned thing," Irene declared aloud as she drew a fragile stocking over a pale beige-coloured foot. "Aha! Swearing again, are you, madam? Caught you in the act that time." Brian Redfield had come into the room in that noiseless way which, in spite of the years of their life together, still had the power to disconcert her. He stood looking down on her with that amused smile of his, which was just the faintest bit supercilious, and yet was somehow very becoming to him. Hastily Irene pulled on the other stocking and slipped her feet into the slippers beside her chair. "And what brought on this particular outburst of profanity? That is, if an indulgent but perturbed husband may inquire. The mother of sons, too! The times, alas, the times!" "I've had this letter," Irene told him, "and I'm sure that anybody'll admit it's enough to make a saint swear. The nerve of her!" She passed the letter to him, and in the act made a little mental frown. For with a nicety of perception she saw that she was doing it instead of answering his question with words, so that he might be occupied while she hurried through her dressing. For she was late again, and Brian, she well knew, detested that. Why, oh why, couldn't she ever manage to be on time? Brian had been up for ages, had made some calls for all she knew, besides having taken the boys downtown to school, and she wasn't dressed yet, had only begun. Damn Clare! This morning it was her fault. Brian sat down and bent his head over the letter, puckering his brows slightly in his effort to make out Clare's scrawl. Irene, who had risen and was standing before the mirror, ran a comb through her black hair, then tossed her head with a light characteristic gesture, in order to disarrange a little the set locks. She touched a powder puff to her warm olive skin, and then put on her frock with a motion so hasty that it was with some difficulty properly adjusted. At last she was ready, though she didn't immediately say so, but stood instead looking with a sort of curious detachment at her husband across the room. Brian, she was thinking, was extremely good-looking. Not, of course, pretty or effeminate. The slight irregularity of his nose saved him from the prettiness, and the rather marked heaviness of his chin saved him from the effeminacy. But he was, in a pleasant, masculine way, rather handsome. And yet wouldn't he, perhaps, have been merely ordinarily good-looking but for the richness, the beauty of his skin, which was of an exquisitely fine texture and deep copper colour? He looked up and said, "Clare? That must be the girl you told me about meeting the last time you were out home. The one you went to tea with?" Irene's answer to that was an inclination of the head. "I'm ready," she said. They were going downstairs, Brian deftly, unnecessarily, piloting her round the two short curved steps just before the centre landing. "You're not," he asked, "going to see her?" His words, however, were in reality not a question, but, as Irene was aware, an admonition. Her front teeth just touched. She spoke through them, and her tones held a thin sarcasm. "Brian, darling, I'm really not such an idiot that I don't realize that if a man calls me a nigger it's his fault the first time, but mine if he has the opportunity to do it again." They went into the dining-room. He drew back her chair, and she sat down behind the fat-bellied German coffee-pot, which sent out its morning fragrance, mingled with the smell of crisp toast and savoury bacon, in the distance. With his long, nervous fingers he picked up the morning paper from his own chair and sat down. Zulena, a small mahogany-coloured creature, brought in the grapefruit. They took up their spoons. Out of the silence Brian spoke, blandly. "My dear, you misunderstand me entirely. I simply meant that I hope you're not going to let her pester you. She will, you know, if you give her half a chance, and she's anything at all like your description of her. Anyway, they always do. Besides," he corrected, "the man, her husband, didn't call you a nigger. There's a difference, you know." "No, certainly he didn't. Not actually. He couldn't, not very well, since he didn't know. But he would have. It amounts to the same thing, and I'm sure it was just as unpleasant." I don't know. But it seems to me," he pointed out, "that you, my dear, had all the advantage. You knew what his opinion of you was, while he... well, 'twas ever thus. We know, always have. They don't. Not quite. It has, you will admit, its humorous side, and sometimes its conveniences." She poured the coffee. "I can't see it. I'm going to write Clare. Today, if I can find a minute. It's a thing we might as well settle definitely and immediately. Curious, isn't it, that knowing, as she does, his unqualified attitude, she still—" Brian interrupted. "It's always that way. Never known it to fail. Remember Albert Hammond, how he used to be forever haunting 7th Avenue and Lenox Avenue, in the dancing places, until some shine took a shot at him for casting an eye toward his Sheba. They always come back. I've seen it happen time and time again." "But why?" Irene wanted to know. "Why?" "If I knew that, I'd know what race is." "But wouldn't you think that having got the thing, or things, they were after, and at such risk, they'd be satisfied? Or afraid?" "Yes," Brian agreed. "You certainly would think so. But the fact remains, they aren't. Not satisfied, I mean. I think they're scared enough most of the time, when they give way to the urge and slip back. Not scared enough to stop them, though. Why, the good God only knows." Irene leaned forward, speaking, she was aware, with a vehemence absolutely unnecessary, but which she could not control. "Well, Clare can just count me out. I've no intention of being the link between her and her poorer, darker brethren. After that scene in Chicago, too. To calmly expect me—" She stopped short, suddenly too wrathful for words. "Quite right. The only sensible thing to do. Let her miss you. It's an unhealthy business, the whole affair. Always is." Irene nodded. "More coffee?" she offered. "Thanks, no." He took up his paper again, spreading it open with a little rattling noise. Zulena came in bringing more toast. Brian took a slice and bit into it with that audible crunching sound that Irene disliked so intensely, and turned back to his paper. She said, "It's funny about passing. We disapprove of it and at the same time condone it. It excites our contempt, and yet we rather admire it. We shy away from it with an odd kind of revulsion, but we protect it." "Instinct of the race to survive and expand." "Rot! Everything can't be explained by some general biological phrase." "Absolutely everything can. Look at the so-called whites, who've left bastards all over the known earth. Same thing in them. Instinct of the race to survive and expand." With that Irene didn't at all agree, but many arguments in the past had taught her the futility of attempting to combat Brian on ground where he was more nearly at home than she. Ignoring his unqualified assertion, she slid away from the subject entirely. "I wonder," she asked, "if you'll have time to run me down to the printing office. It's on 116th Street. I've got to see about some handbills and some more tickets for the dance." "Yes, of course. How's it going? Everything all set?" "Yes, I guess so. The boxes are all sold, and nearly all the first batch of tickets. And we expect to take in almost as much again at the door. Then there's all that cake to sell. It's a terrible lot of work, though." "I'll bet it is. Uplifting the brother's no easy job. I'm as busy as a cat with fleas, myself." And over his face there came a shadow. "Lord, how I hate sick people, and their stupid meddling families, and smelly dirty rooms, and climbing filthy steps in dark hallways." "Surely," Irene began, fighting back the fear and irritation that she felt. "Surely—" Her husband silenced her, saying sharply, "Let's not talk about it, please." And immediately, in his usual slightly mocking tone, he asked, "Are you ready to go now? I haven't a great deal of time to wait." He got up. She followed him out into the hall without replying. He picked up his soft brown hat from the small table and stood a moment whirling it round on his long tea-coloured fingers. Irene, watching him, was thinking, "It isn't fair. It isn't fair." After all these years to still blame her like this. Hadn't his success proved that she'd been right in insisting that he stick to his profession right there in New York? Couldn't he see, even now, that it had been best? Not for her. Oh no, not for her. She had never really considered herself, but for him and the boys. Was she never to be free of it, that fear which crouched always deep down within her, stealing away the sense of security, the feeling of permanence from the life which she had so admirably arranged for them all, and desired so ardently to have remain as it was? That strange, and to her fantastic notion of Brian's going off to Brazil, which, though unmentioned, yet lived within him, how it frightened her, and, yes, had angered her. "Well?" he asked lightly. "I'll just get my things. 1 minute," she promised, and turned upstairs. Her voice had been even and her step was firm, but in her there was no slackening of the agitation, of the alarms, which Brian's expression of discontent had raised. He had never spoken of his desire since that long ago time of storm and strain, of hateful and nearly disastrous quarrelling, when she had so firmly opposed him, so sensibly pointed out its utter impossibility and its probable consequences to her and the boys, and had even hinted at a dissolution of their marriage in the event of his persistence in his idea. No, there had been, in all the years that they had lived together since then, no other talk of it, no more than there had been any other quarrelling or any other threats. But because, so she insisted, the bond of flesh and spirit between them was so strong, she knew, had always known, that his dissatisfaction had continued, as had his dislike and disgust for his profession and his country. A feeling of uneasiness stole upon her at the inconceivable suspicion that she might have been wrong in her estimate of her husband's character. But she squirmed away from it. Impossible! She couldn't have been wrong. Everything proved that she had been right. more than right, if such a thing could be. And all, she assured herself, because she understood him so well, because she had, actually, a special talent for understanding him. It was, as she saw it, the one thing that had been the basis of the success which she had made of a marriage that had threatened to fail. She knew him as well as he knew himself, or better. Then why worry? The thing, this discontent which had exploded into words, would surely die, flicker out at last. True, she had in the past often been tempted to believe that it had died, only to become conscious, in some instinctive subtle way, that she had been merely deceiving herself for a while, and that it still lived. But it would die. Of that she was certain. She had only to direct and guide her man, to keep him going in the right direction. She put on her coat and adjusted her hat. Yes, it would die, as long ago as she had made up her mind that it should. But in the meantime, while it was still living and still had the power to flare up and alarm her, it would have to be banked, smothered, and something offered in its stead. She would have to make some plan, some decision, at once. She frowned, for it annoyed her intensely. For, though temporary, it would be important and perhaps disturbing. Irene didn't like changes, particularly changes that affected the smooth routine of her household. Well, it couldn't be helped. Something would have to be done, and immediately. She took up her purse and, drawing on her gloves, ran down the steps and out through the door which Brian held open for her, and stepped into the waiting car. "You know," she said, settling herself into the seat beside him, "I'm awfully glad to get this minute alone with you. It does seem that we're always so busy. I do hate that. But what can we do? I've had something on my mind for ever so long, something that needs talking over, and really serious consideration." The car's engine rumbled as it moved out from the curb and into the scant traffic of the street under Brian's expert guidance. She studied his profile. They turned into 7th Avenue. Then he said, "Well, let's have it. No time like the present for the settling of weighty matters." "It's about Junior. I wonder if he isn't going too fast in school. We do forget that he's not 11 yet. Surely it can't be good for him to... well, if he is, I mean. Going too fast, you know. Of course you know more about these things than I do. You're better able to judge. That is, if you've noticed or thought about it at all." "I do wish, Irene, that you wouldn't be forever fretting about those kids. They're all right. Perfectly all right. Good, strong, healthy boys, especially Junior. Most especially Junior." "Well, I suppose you're right. You're expected to know about things like that, and I'm sure you wouldn't make a mistake about your own boy." Now why had she said that? "But that isn't all. I'm terribly afraid he's picked up some queer ideas about things, some things, from the older boys, you know." Her manner was consciously light. Apparently she was intent on the maze of traffic, but she was still watching Brian's face closely. On it was a peculiar expression. Was it, could it possibly be, a mixture of scorn and distaste? "Queer ideas?" he repeated. "Do you mean ideas about sex, Irene?" "Yes. Not quite nice ones. Dreadful jokes and things like that." "Oh, I see," he threw at her. For a while there was silence between them. After a moment he demanded bluntly, "Well, what of it? If sex isn't a joke, what is it? And what is a joke?" "As you please, Brian. He's your son, you know." Her voice was clear, level, disapproving. "Exactly. And you're trying to make a mollycoddle out of him. Well, just let me tell you I won't have it. And you needn't think I'm going to let you change him to some nice kindergarten kind of a school because he's getting a little necessary education. I won't. He'll stay right where he is. The sooner and the more he learns about sex, the better for him. And most certainly if he learns that it's a grand joke, the greatest in the world. It'll keep him from lots of disappointments later on." Irene didn't answer. They reached the printing shop. She got out, emphatically slamming the car's door behind her. There was a piercing agony of misery in her heart. She hadn't intended to behave like this, but her extreme resentment at his attitude, the sense of having been wilfully misunderstood and reproved, drove her to fury. Inside the shop she stilled the trembling of her lips and drove back her rising anger. Her business transacted, she came back to the car in a chastened mood. But against the armour of Brian's stubborn silence she heard herself saying in a calm, metallic voice, "I don't believe I'll go back just now. I've remembered that I've got to do something about getting something decent to wear. I haven't a rag that's fit to be seen. I'll take the bus downtown." Brian merely doffed his hat in that maddening polite way which so successfully curbed and yet revealed his temper. "Good-bye," she said bitingly. "Thanks for the lift," and turned towards the avenue. What, she wondered contritely, was she to do next? She was vexed with herself for having chosen, as it had turned out, so clumsy an opening for what she had intended to suggest, some European school for Junior next year, and Brian to take him over. If she had been able to present her plan, and he had accepted it, as she was sure that he would have done, with other more favourable opening methods, he would have had that to look forward to as a break in the easy monotony that seemed, for some reason she was wholly unable to grasp, so hateful to him. She was even more vexed at her own explosion of anger. What could have got into her to give way to it in such a moment? Gradually her mood passed. She drew back from the failure, her first attempt at substitution, not so much discouraged as disappointed and ashamed. It might be, she reflected, that, in addition to her ill-timed loss of temper, she had been too hasty in her eagerness to distract him, had rushed too closely on the heels of his outburst, and had thus aroused his suspicions and his obstinacy. She had but to wait. Another more appropriate time would come, tomorrow, next week, next month. It wasn't now, as it had once been, that she was afraid that he would throw everything aside and rush off to that remote place of his heart's desire. He wouldn't, she knew. He was fond of her, loved her, in his slightly undemonstrative way. And there were the boys. It was only that she wanted him to be happy, resenting, however, his inability to be so with things as they were, and never acknowledging that though she did want him to be happy, it was only in her own way and by some plan of hers for him that she truly desired him to be so. Nor did she admit that all other plans, all other ways, she regarded as menaces, more or less indirect, to that security of place and substance which she insisted upon for her sons, and in a lesser degree for herself. End of Chapter 1. Part 2, Chapter 2, of Passing. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Elizabeth Klett. Passing, by Nella Larsen. Part 2, Chapter 2. 5 days had gone by since Clare Kendry's appealing letter. Irene Redfield had not replied to it, nor had she had any other word from Clare. She had not carried out her first intention of writing at once, because on going back to the letter for Clare's address, she had come upon something which, in the rigour of her determination to maintain unbroken between them the wall that Clare herself had raised, she had forgotten or not fully noted. It was the fact that Clare had requested her to direct her answer to the post-office's general delivery. That had angered Irene, and increased her disdain and contempt for the other. Tearing the letter across, she had flung it into the scrap-basket. It wasn't so much Clare's carefulness and her desire for secrecy in their relations, Irene understood the need for that, as that Clare should have doubted her discretion, implied that she might not be cautious in the wording of her reply and the choice of a posting-box. Having always had complete confidence in her own good judgment and tact, Irene couldn't bear to have anyone seem to question them, certainly not Clare Kendry. In another, calmer moment she decided that it was, after all, better to answer nothing, to explain nothing, to refuse nothing, to dispose of the matter simply by not writing at all. Clare, of whom it couldn't be said that she was stupid, would not mistake the implication of that silence. She might, and Irene was sure that she would, choose to ignore it and write again, but that didn't matter. The whole thing would be very easy. The basket for all letters, silence for their answers. Most likely she and Clare would never meet again. Well, she, for one, could endure that. Since childhood their lives had never really touched. Actually, they were strangers. Strangers in their ways and means of living. Strangers in their desires and ambitions. Strangers even in their racial consciousness. Between them the barrier was just as high, just as broad, and just as firm as if in Clare did not run that strain of black blood. In truth, it was higher, broader, and firmer, because for her there were perils, not known or imagined, by those others who had no such secrets to alarm or endanger them. The day was getting on towards evening. It was past the middle of October. There had been a week of cold rain, drenching the rotting leaves which had fallen from the poor trees that lined the street on which the Redfields' house was located, and sending a damp air of penetrating chill into the house, with a hint of cold days to come. In Irene's room a low fire was burning. Outside only a dull grey light was left of the day. Inside, lamps had already been lighted. From the floor above there was the sound of young voices, sometimes Junior's serious and positive, again Ted's deceptively gracious one. Often there was laughter, or the noise of commotion, tussling, or toys being slammed down. Junior, tall for his age, was almost incredibly like his father in feature and colouring, but his temperament was hers, practical and determined, rather than Brian's. Ted, speculative and withdrawn, was apparently less positive in his ideas and desires. About him there was a deceiving air of candour that was, Irene knew, like his father's show of reasonable acquiescence. If, for the time being, and with a charming appearance of artlessness, he submitted to the force of superior strength, or some other immovable condition or circumstance, it was because of his intense dislike of scenes and unpleasant argument. Brian over again. Gradually Irene's thoughts slipped away from Junior and Ted, to become wholly absorbed in their father. The old fear, with strength increased, her fear for the future, had again laid its hand on her, and try as she might she could not shake it off. It was as if she had admitted to herself that against the easy surface of her husband's concordance with her wishes, which had, since the war had given him back to her physically unimpaired, covered an increasing inclination to tear himself and his possessions loose from their proper setting, she was helpless. The chagrin which she had felt at her first failure to subvert this latest manifestation of his discontent had receded, leaving in its wake an uneasy depression. Were all her efforts, all her labours to make up to him that one loss, all her silent striving to prove to him that her way had been best, all her ministrations to him, all her outward sinking of self, to count for nothing in some unperceived sudden moment? And if so, what then would be the consequences to the boys, to her, to Brian himself? Endless searching had brought no answer to these questions. There was only an intense weariness from their shuttle-like procession in her brain. The noise and commotion from above grew increasingly louder. Irene was about to go to the stairway and request the boys to be quieter in their play, when she heard the door-bell ringing. Now who was that likely to be? She listened to Zulina's heels faintly tapping on their way to the door, then to the shifting sound of her feet on the steps, then to her light knock on the bedroom door. "Yes, come in," Irene told her. Zulina stood in the doorway. She said, "Someone to see you, Mrs. Redfield." Her tone was discreetly regretful, as if to convey that she was reluctant to disturb her mistress at that hour, and for a stranger. "A Mrs. Bellew." "Clare." "Oh, dear. Tell her, Zulina," Irene began, "that I can't— No, I'll see her. Please bring her up here." She heard Zulina pass down the hall, down the stairs, then stood up, smoothing out the tumbled green and ivory draperies of her dress with light stroking pats. At the mirror she dusted a little powder on her nose and brushed out her hair. She meant to tell Clare Kendry at once, and definitely, that it was of no use her coming, that she couldn't be responsible, that she talked it over with Brian, who had agreed with her that it was wiser for Clare's own sake to refrain. But that was as far as she got in her rehearsal, for Clare had come softly into the room without knocking, and before Irene could greet her, had dropped a kiss on her dark curls. Looking at the woman before her, Irene Redfield had a sudden, inexplicable onrush of affectionate feeling. Reaching out, she grasped Clare's two hands in her own, and cried with something like awe in her voice, "Dear God, but aren't you lovely, Clare?" Clare tossed that aside, like the furs and small blue hat which she threw on the bed before seating herself slantwise in Irene's favourite chair, with one foot curled under her. "Didn't you mean to answer my letter, 'Rene?" she asked gravely. Irene looked away. She had that uncomfortable feeling that one has when one has not been wholly kind or wholly true. Clare went on. "Every day I went to that nasty little post-office place. I'm sure they were all beginning to think that I'd been carrying on an illicit love affair, and that the man had thrown me over. Every morning the same answer, 'Nothing for you.' I got into an awful fright, thinking that something might have happened to your letter, or to mine. And half the nights I would lie awake looking out at the watery stars, hopeless things, the stars, worrying and wondering. But at last it soaked in that you hadn't written and didn't intend to. And then, well, as soon as ever I'd seen Jack off for Florida, I came straight here. And now, 'Rene, please tell me quite frankly why you didn't answer my letter." "Because, you see—" Irene broke off and kept Clare waiting while she lit a cigarette, blew out the match and dropped it into a tray. She was trying to collect her arguments, for some sixth sense warned her that it was going to be harder than she thought to convince Clare Kendry of the folly of Harlem for her. Finally she proceeded. "I can't help thinking that you ought not to come up here, ought not to run the risk of knowing Negroes." "You mean you don't want me, 'Rene?" Irene hadn't supposed that anyone could look so hurt. She said quite gently, "No, Clare, it's not that. But even you must see that it's terribly foolish, and not just the right thing." The tinkle of Clare's laugh rang out, while she passed her hands over the bright sweep of her hair. "Oh, 'Rene," she cried, "you're priceless! And you haven't changed a bit. The right thing!" Leaning forward, she looked curiously into Irene's disapproving brown eyes. You really can't mean exactly that. Nobody could. It's simply unbelievable." Irene was on her feet before she realized that she had risen. "What I really mean," she retorted, "is that it's dangerous and that you ought not to run such silly risks. No one ought to. You least of all." Her voice was brittle, for into her mind had come a thought, strange and irrelevant, a suspicion that had surprised and shocked her and driven her to her feet. It was that in spite of her determined selfishness, the woman before her was yet capable of heights and depths of feeling that she, Irene Redfield, had never known. Indeed, never cared to know. The thought, the suspicion, was gone as quickly as it had come. Clare said, "Oh, me!" Irene touched her arm caressingly, as if in contrition for that flashing thought. "Yes, Clare, you. It's not safe. Not safe at all." "Safe!" It seemed to Irene that Clare had snapped her teeth down on the word and then flung it from her. And for another flying second she had that suspicion of Clare's ability for a quality of feeling that was to her strange and even repugnant. She was aware, too, of a dim premonition of some impending disaster. It was as if Clare Kendry had said to her, for whom safety, security were all important, "Safe! Damn being safe!" and meant it. With a gesture of impatience she sat down. In a voice of cool formality she said, "Brian and I have talked the whole thing over carefully and decided that it isn't wise. He says it's always a dangerous business, this coming back. He's seen more than one come to grief because of it. And Clare, considering everything, Mr. Bellew's attitude and all that, don't you think you ought to be as careful as you can?" Clare's deep voice broke the small silence that had followed Irene's speech. She said, speaking almost plaintively, "I ought to have known. It's Jack. I don't blame you for being angry, though I must say you behaved beautifully that day. But I did think you'd understand, 'Rene. It was that, partly, that has made me want to see other people. It just swooped down and changed everything. If it hadn't been for that, I'd have gone on to the end, never seeing any of you. But that did something to me, and I've been so lonely since. You can't know. Not close to a single soul, never anyone to really talk to." Irene pressed out her cigarette. While doing so, she saw again the vision of Clare Kendry staring disdainfully down at the face of her father, and thought that it would be like that she would look at her husband if he lay dead before her. Her own resentment was swept aside, and her voice held an accent of pity as she exclaimed, "Why, Clare, I didn't know. Forgive me. I feel like 7 beasts. It was stupid of me not to realize." "No, not at all. You couldn't. Nobody, none of you could," Clare moaned. The black eyes filled with tears that ran down her cheeks and spilled into her lap, ruining the priceless velvet of her dress. Her long hands were a little uplifted and clasped tightly together. Her effort to speak moderately was obvious, but not successful. "How could you know? How could you? You're free. You're happy. And," with faint derision, "safe." Irene passed over that touch of derision, for the poignant rebellion of the other's words had brought the tears to her own eyes, though she didn't allow them to fall. The truth was that she knew weeping did not become her. Few women, she imagined, wept as attractively as Clare. "I'm beginning to believe," she murmured, "that no one is ever completely happy or free or safe." "Well, then, what does it matter? One risk more or less if we're not safe anyway. If even you're not, it can't make all the difference in the world. It can't to me. Besides, I'm used to risks. And this isn't such a big one as you're trying to make it." "Oh, but it is. And it can make all the difference in the world. There's your little girl, Clare. Think of the consequences to her." Clare's face took on a startled look, as though she were totally unprepared for this new weapon with which Irene had assailed her. Seconds passed, during which she sat with stricken eyes and compressed lips. "I think," she said at last, "that being a mother is the cruelest thing in the world." Her clasped hands swayed forward and back again, and her scarlet mouth trembled irrepressibly. "Yes," Irene softly agreed. For a moment she was unable to say more, so accurately had Clare put into words that which, not so definitely defined, was so often in her own heart of late. At the same time she was conscious that here, to her hand, was a reason which could not be lightly brushed aside. "Yes," she repeated, "and the most responsible, Clare. We mothers are all responsible for the security and happiness of our children. Think what it would mean to your Marjorie if Mr. Bellew should find out. You'd probably lose her. And even if you didn't, nothing that concerned her would ever be the same again. He'd never forget that she had Negro blood. And if she should learn— well, I believe that after 12 it is too late to learn a thing like that. She'd never forgive you. You may be used to risks, but this is one you mustn't take, Clare. It's a selfish whim, and unnecessary, and— Yes, Zulena, what is it?" she inquired, a trifle tartly, of the servant who had silently materialized in the doorway. "The telephone's for you, Mrs. Redfield. It's Mr. Wentworth." "All right, thank you. I'll take it here." And with a muttered apology to Clare, she took up the instrument. "Hello?" "Yes, Hugh." "Oh, quite. And you?" "I'm sorry, every single thing's gone." "Oh, too bad." "Yes, I suppose you could. Not very pleasant, though." "Yes, of course, in a pinch everything goes." "Wait, I've got it. I'll change mine with whoever's next to you, and you can have that." "No." "I mean it." "I'll be so busy I shan't know whether I'm sitting or standing." "As long as Brian has a place to drop down now and then." "Not a single soul." "No, don't." "That's nice. My love to Bianca. I'll see to it right away and call you back. Goodbye." She hung up and turned back to Clare, a little frown on her softly chiselled features. "It's the NWL dance," she explained. "The Negro Welfare League, you know. I'm on the ticket committee. Or rather, I am the ticket committee. Thank heaven it comes off tomorrow night and doesn't happen again for a year. I'm about crazy, and now I've got to persuade somebody to change boxes with me." "That wasn't," Clare asked, "Hugh Wentworth? Not the Hugh Wentworth?" Irene inclined her head. On her face was a tiny triumphant smile. "Yes, the Hugh Wentworth. Do you know him?" "No, how should I? But I do know about him, and I've read a book or two of his." "Awfully good, aren't they?" I suppose so. Sort of contemptuous, I thought. As if he more or less despised everything and everybody." "I shouldn't be a bit surprised if he did. Still, he's about earned the right to. Lived on the edges of nowhere in at least 3 continents. Been through every danger in all kinds of savage places. It's no wonder he thinks the rest of us are a lazy, self-pampering lot. Hugh's a dear, though. Generous as one of the 12 disciples. Give you the shirt off his back. Bianca, that's his wife, is nice too." "And he's coming up here to your dance?" Irene asked why not. "It seems rather curious, a man like that going to a Negro dance." This, Irene told her, was the year 1927 in the city of New York, and hundreds of white people of Hugh Wentworth's type came to affairs in Harlem, more all the time. So many that Brian had said, "Pretty soon the colored people won't be allowed in at all, or we'll have to sit in Jim Crowed sections." "What do they come for?" "Same reason you're here. To see Negroes." "But why?" "Various motives," Irene explained. "A few purely and frankly to enjoy themselves. Others to get material to turn into shekels. More to gaze on these great and near-great while they gaze on the Negroes." Clare clapped her hand. "'Rene, suppose I come too. It sounds terribly interesting and amusing, and I don't see why I shouldn't." Irene, who was regarding her through narrowed eyelids, had the same thought that she had had 2 years ago on the roof of the Drayton, that Clare Kendry was just a shade too good-looking. Her tone was on the edge of irony as she said, "You mean because so many other white people go?" A pale rose-colour came into Clare's ivory cheeks. She lifted a hand in protest. "Don't be silly. Certainly not. I mean that in a crowd of that kind I shouldn't be noticed." On the contrary, was Irene's opinion. It might even be doubly dangerous. Some friend or acquaintance of John Bellew or herself might see and recognize her. At that Clare laughed for a long time, little musical trills following one another in sequence after sequence. It was as if the thought of any friend of John Bellew's going to a Negro dance was to her the most amusing thing in the world. "I don't think," she said when she had done laughing, "we need worry about that." Irene, however, wasn't so sure, but all her efforts to dissuade Clare were useless. To her, "You can never tell whom you're likely to meet there," Clare's rejoinder was, "I'll take my chance on getting by." "Besides, you won't know a soul, and I shall be too busy to look after you. You'll be bored stiff." I won't. If nobody asks me to dance, not even Dr. Redfield, I'll just sit and gaze on the great and near great too. Do, 'Rene, be polite and invite me." Irene turned away from the caress of Clare's smile, saying promptly and positively, "I will not." "I mean to go anyway," Clare retorted, and her voice was no less positive than Irene's. "Oh no, you couldn't possibly go there alone. It's a public thing. All sorts of people go, anybody who can pay $1, even ladies of easy virtue looking for trade. If you were to go there alone, you might be mistaken for one of them, and that wouldn't be too pleasant." Clare laughed again. "Thanks. I never have been. It might be amusing. I'm warning you, 'Rene, that if you're not going to be nice and take me, I'll still be among those present. I suppose my $1's as good as anyone's." "Oh, the $1! Don't be a fool, Clare. I don't care where you go or what you do. All I'm concerned with is the unpleasantness and possible danger which your going might incur, because of your situation. To put it frankly, I shouldn't like to be mixed up in any row of the kind." She had risen again as she spoke, and was standing at the window, lifting and spreading the small yellow chrysanthemums in the grey stone jar on the sill. Her hand shook slightly, for she was in a near rage of impatience and exasperation. Clare's face looked strange, as if she wanted to cry again. One of her satin-covered feet swung restlessly back and forth. She said vehemently, violently almost, "Damn Jack! He keeps me out of everything I want. I could kill him. I expect I shall some day." "I wouldn't," Irene advised her. "You see, there's still capital punishment, in this state at least. And really, Clare, after everything's said, I can't see that you've got a right to put all the blame on him. You've got to admit that there's his side to the thing. You didn't tell him you were coloured, so he's got no way of knowing about this hankering of yours after Negroes, or that it galls you to fury to hear them called niggers and black devils. As far as I can see, you'll just have to endure some things and give up others. As we've said before, everything must be paid for. Do please be reasonable." But Clare, it was plain, had shut away reason as well as caution. She shook her head. I can't, she said. "I would if I could, but I can't. You don't know, you can't realize how I want to see Negroes, to be with them again, to talk with them, to hear them laugh." And in the look she gave Irene there was something groping and hopeless, and yet so absolutely determined that it was like an image of the futile searching and the firm resolution in Irene's own soul, and increased the feeling of doubt and compunction that had been growing within her about Clare Kendry. She gave in. "Oh, come if you want to. I suppose you're right. Once can't do such a terrible lot of harm." Pushing aside Clare's extravagant thanks, for immediately she was sorry that she had consented, she said briskly, "Should you like to come up and see my boys?" "I'd love to." They went up, Irene thinking that Brian would consider that she behaved like a spineless fool. And he would be right. She certainly had. Clare was smiling. She stood in the doorway of the boys' playroom, her shadowy eyes looking down on Junior and Ted, who had sprung apart from their tussling. Junior's face had a funny little look of resentment. Ted's was blank. Clare said, "Please don't be cross. Of course I know I've gone and spoiled everything. But maybe, if I promise not to get too much in the way, you'll let me come in just the same." "Sure. Come in if you want to," Ted told her. We can't stop you, you know." He smiled and made her a little bow, and then turned away to a shelf that held his favourite books. Taking one down, he settled himself in the chair and began to read. Junior said nothing, did nothing, merely stood there waiting. "Get up, Ted. That's rude." "This is Theodore, Mrs. Bellew. Please excuse his bad manners. He does know better. And this is Brian Junior. Mrs. Bellew is an old friend of mother's. We used to play together when we were little girls." Clare had gone, and Brian had telephoned that he'd been detained and would have his dinner downtown. Irene was a little glad for that. She was going out later herself, and that meant she wouldn't probably see Brian until morning, and so could put off for a few more hours speaking of Clare and the NWL dance. She was angry with herself, and with Clare, but more with herself for having permitted Clare to tease her into doing something that Brian had, all but expressly, asked her not to do. She didn't want him ruffled, not just then, not while he was possessed of that unreasonable, restless feeling. She was annoyed, too, because she was aware that she had consented to something which, if it went beyond the dance, would involve her in numerous petty inconveniences and evasions, and not only at home with Brian, but outside with friends and acquaintances. The disagreeable possibilities in connection with Clare Kendry's coming among them loomed before her in endless irritating array. Clare, it seemed, still retained her ability to secure the thing that she wanted in the face of any opposition, and in utter disregard of the convenience and desire of others. About her there was some quality, hard and persistent, with the strength and endurance of rock, that would not be beaten or ignored. She couldn't, Irene thought, have had an entirely serene life, not with that dark secret forever crouching in the background of her consciousness. And yet she hadn't the air of a woman whose life had been touched by uncertainty or suffering. Pain, fear, and grief were things that left their mark on people. Even love, that exquisite torturing emotion, left its subtle traces on the countenance. But Clare, she had remained almost what she had always been, an attractive, somewhat lonely child, selfish, wilful, and disturbing. End of Chapter 2. Part 2, Chapter 3. The things which Irene Redfield remembered afterward about the Negro Welfare League dance seemed to her unimportant and unrelated. She remembered the not quite derisive smile with which Brian had cloaked his vexation when she informed him, oh so apologetically, that she had promised to take Clare, and related the conversation of her visit. She remembered her own little choked exclamation of admiration when, on coming downstairs a few minutes later than she had intended, she had rushed into the living-room where Brian was waiting, and found Clare there too. Clare, exquisite, golden, fragrant, flaunting, in a stately gown of shining black taffeta, whose long full skirt lay in graceful folds about her slim golden feet, her glistening hair drawn smoothly back into a small twist at the nape of her neck, her eyes sparkling like dark jewels. Irene, with her new rose-coloured chiffon frock ending at the knees, and her cropped curls, felt dowdy and commonplace. She regretted that she hadn't counselled Clare to wear something ordinary and inconspicuous. What on earth would Brian think of deliberate courting of attention? But if Clare Kendry's appearance had in it anything that was, to Brian Redfield, annoying or displeasing, the fact was not discernible to his wife, as, with an uneasy feeling of guilt, she stood there looking into his face while Clare explained that she and he had made their own introductions, accompanying her words with a little deferential smile for Brian, and receiving in return one of his amused, slightly mocking smiles. She remembered Clare's saying, as they sped northward, "You know, I feel exactly as I used to on the Sunday we went to the Christmas tree celebration. I knew there was going to be a surprise for me, and couldn't quite guess what it was to be. I am so excited. You can't possibly imagine. It's marvellous to be really on the way. I can hardly believe it." At her words and tone a chilly wave of scorn had crept through Irene. All those superlatives. She said, taking care to speak indifferently, "Well, maybe in some ways you'll be surprised, more probably than you anticipate." Brian, at the wheel, had thrown back, "And then again she won't be so very surprised after all, for it'll no doubt be about what she expects, like the Christmas tree." She remembered rushing around here and there, consulting with this person and that one, and now and then snatching a part of a dance with some man whose dancing she particularly liked. She remembered catching glimpses of Clare in the whirling crowd, dancing sometimes with a white man, more often with a Negro, frequently with Brian. Irene was glad that he was being nice to Clare, and glad that Clare was having the opportunity to discover that some coloured men were superior to some white men. She remembered a conversation she had with Hugh Wentworth in a free half-hour, when she had dropped into a chair in an emptied box, and let her gaze wander over the bright crowd below. Young men, old men, white men, black men, youthful women, older women, pink women, golden women, fat men, thin men, tall men, short men, stout women, slim women, stately women, small women, moved by. An old nursery rhyme popped into her head. She turned to Wentworth, who had just taken a seat beside her, and recited it. Rich man, poor man, beggar man, thief, doctor, lawyer, Indian chief. Yes, Wentworth said, that's it. Everybody seems to be here, and a few more. But what I'm trying to find out is the name, status, and race of the blonde beauty out of the fairy tale. She's dancing with Ralph Hazelton at the moment. Nice study in contrasts, that. It was. Clare fair and golden, like a sunlit day. Hazelton dark, with gleaming eyes, like a moonlit night. She's a girl I used to know a long time ago in Chicago, and she wanted especially to meet you. Softly good of her, I'm sure. And now, alas, the usual thing's happened. All these others, these, gentlemen of colour, have driven a mere Nordic from her mind. Stuff. It's a fact. And what happens to all the ladies of my superior race who are lured up here? Look at Bianca. Have I laid eyes on her tonight, except in spots here and there, being twirled about by some Ethiopian? I have not. But, Hugh, you've got to admit that the average coloured man is a better dancer than the average white man. That is, if the celebrities and butter and egg men who find their way up here are fair specimens of white terpsichorean art. Not having tripped the light fantastic with any of the males, I'm not in a position to argue the point. But I don't think it's merely that. It's something else, some other attraction. They're always raving about the good looks of some Negro, preferably an unusually dark one. Take Hazelton there, for example. Dozens of women have declared him to be fascinatingly handsome. How about you, Irene? Do you think he's, ravishingly beautiful? I do not, and I don't think the others do either. Not honestly, I mean. I think what they feel is, well, a kind of emotional excitement. You know, the sort of thing you feel in the presence of something strange, and even perhaps a bit repugnant to you. Something so different that it's really at the opposite end of the pole from all your accustomed notions of beauty. Damned if I don't think you're half right. I'm sure I am. Completely. Except, of course, when it's just patronizing kindness on their part. And I know coloured girls have experienced the same thing, the other way round, naturally. And the men? You don't subscribe to the general opinion about their reason for coming up here? Purely predatory. Or do you? No. More curious, I should say. Wentworth, whose eyes were a clouded amber colour, had given her a long, searching look that was really a stare. He said, "All of this is awfully interesting, Irene. We've got to have a long talk about it sometime soon. There's your friend from Chicago, first time up here and all that. A case in point." Irene's smile had only just lifted the corners of her painted lips. A match blazed in Wentworth's broad hands as he lighted her cigarette in his own, and flickered out before he asked, "Or isn't she?" Her smile changed to a laugh. "Oh, Hugh, you're so clever. You usually know everything, even how to tell the sheep from the goats. What do you think? Is she?" He blew a long contemplative wreath of smoke. "Damned if I know. I'll be as sure as anything that I've learned the trick. And then in the next minute I'll find I couldn't pick some of 'em if my life depended on it." "Well, don't let that worry you. Nobody can. Not by looking." "Not by looking, eh? Meaning?" "I'm afraid I can't explain. Not clearly. There are ways, but they're not definite or tangible." "Feeling of kinship or something like that?" "Good heavens, no. Nobody has that, except for their in-laws." "Right again. But go on about the sheep and the goats." "Well, take my own experience with Dorothy Tompkins. I'd met her 4 or 5 times in groups and crowds of people before I knew she wasn't a Negro. One day I went to an awful tea, terribly dicty. Dorothy was there. We got talking. In less than 5 minutes I knew she was Fay. Not from anything she did or said, or anything in her appearance. Just Just something. A thing that couldn't be registered." "Yes, I understand what you mean. Yet lots of people pass all the time." "Not on our side, Hugh. It's easy for a Negro to pass for white. But I don't think it would be so simple for a white person to pass for coloured." "Never thought of that." "No, you wouldn't. Why should you?" He regarded her critically through mists of smoke. "Slippin' me, Irene?" She said soberly, "Not you, Hugh. I'm too fond of you. And you're too sincere." And she remembered that towards the end of the dance Brian had come to her and said, "I'll drop you first and then run Clare down," and that he had been doubtful of her discretion when she had explained to him that he wouldn't have to bother because she had asked Bianca Wentworth to take her down with them. Did she, he had asked, think it had been wise to tell them about Clare? "I told them nothing," she said sharply, for she was unbearably tired, "except that she was at the Walsingham. It's on their way. And really I haven't thought anything about the wisdom of it, but now that I do, I'd say it's much better for them to take her than you." "As you please. She's your friend, you know," he had answered, with a disclaiming shrug of his shoulders. Except for these few unconnected things, the dance faded to a blurred memory, its outlines mingling with those of other dances of its kind that she had attended in the past and would attend in the future. End of Chapter 3. Part 2, Chapter 4. But undistinctive as the dance had seemed, it was nevertheless important, for it marked the beginning of a new factor in Irene Redfield's life, something that left its trace on all the future years of her existence. It was the beginning of a new friendship with Clare Kendry. She came to them frequently after that, always with a touching gladness that welled up and overflowed on all the Redfield household. Yet Irene could never be sure whether her comings were a joy or a vexation. Certainly she was no trouble. She had not to be entertained or even noticed, if anyone could ever avoid noticing Clare. If Irene happened to be out or occupied, Clare could very happily amuse herself with Ted and Junior, who had conceived for her an admiration that verged on adoration, especially Ted. Or, lacking the boys, she would descend to the kitchen, and with, to Irene, an exasperating childlike lack of perception, spend her visit in talk and merriment with Zulena and Sadie. Irene, while secretly resenting these visits to the playroom and kitchen, for some obscure reason which she shied away from putting into words, never requested that Clare make an end of them, or hinted that she wouldn't have spoiled her own Marjorie so outrageously, nor been so friendly with white servants. Brian looked on these things with the same tolerant amusement that marked his entire attitude towards Clare. Never since his faintly derisive surprise at Irene's information that she was to go with them the night of the dance had he shown any disapproval of Clare's presence. On the other hand, it couldn't be said that her presence seemed to please him. It didn't annoy or disturb him so far as Irene could judge. That was all. Didn't he, she once asked him, think Clare was extraordinarily beautiful? "No," he had answered. "That is, not particularly." "Brian, you're fooling." "No, honestly. Maybe I'm fussy. I suppose she'd be an unusually good-looking white woman. I like my ladies darker. Beside an A No. 1 Sheba, she simply hasn't got 'em." Clare went sometimes with Irene and Brian to parties and dances, and on a few occasions when Irene hadn't been able or inclined to go out, she had gone alone with Brian to some bridge party or benefit dance. Once in a while she came formally to dine with them. She wasn't, however, in spite of her poise and air of worldliness, the ideal dinner-party guest. Beyond the aesthetic pleasure one got from watching her, she contributed little, sitting for the most part silent, an odd, dreaming look in her hypnotic eyes. Though she could, for some purpose of her own, the desire to be included in some party being made up to go cabareting, or an invitation to a dance or a tea, talk fluently and entertainingly. She was generally liked. She was so friendly and responsive, and so ready to press the sweet food of flattery on all. Nor did she object to appearing a bit pathetic and ill-used, so that people could feel sorry for her. And, no matter how often she came among them, she still remained someone apart, a little mysterious and strange, someone to wonder about, and to admire and pity. Her visits were undecided and uncertain, being, as they were, dependent on the presence or absence of John Bellew in the city, but she did once in a while manage to steal uptown for an afternoon, even when he was not away. As time went on without any apparent danger of discovery, even Irene ceased to be perturbed about the possibility of Clare's husband's stumbling on her racial identity. The daughter, Marjorie, had been left in Switzerland in school, for Clare and Ballou would be going back in the early spring. In March, Clare thought, "And how I do hate to think of it," she would say, always with a suggestion of leashed rebellion. "But I can't see how I'm going to get out of it. Jack won't hear of my staying behind. If I could have just a couple of months more in New York, alone, I mean, I'd be the happiest thing in the world." "I imagine you'll be happy enough once you get away," Irene told her one day when she was bewailing her approaching departure. "Remember, there's Marjorie. Think how glad you'll be to see her after all this time." "Children aren't everything," was Clare Kendry's answer to that. "There are other things in the world, though I admit some people don't seem to suspect it." And she laughed, more, it seemed, at some secret joke of her own than at her words. Irene replied, "You know you don't mean that, Clare. You're only trying to tease me. I know very well that I take being a mother rather seriously. I am wrapped up in my boys and the running of my house. I can't help it. And really I don't think it's anything to laugh at." And though she was aware of the slight primness in her words and attitude, she had neither power nor wish to efface it. Clare, suddenly very sober and sweet, said, "You're right. It's no laughing matter. It's shameful of me to tease you, 'Rene. You are so good." And she reached out and gave Irene's hand a little affectionate squeeze. "Don't think," she added, "whatever happens, that I'll ever forget how good you've been to me." "Oh, nonsense." "Oh, but you have, you have. It's just that I haven't any proper morals or sense of duty, as you have, that makes me act as I do." "Now you are talking nonsense." "But it's true, 'Rene. Can't you realize that I'm not like you a bit? Why, to get the things I want badly enough, I'd do anything, hurt anybody, throw anything away. Really, 'Rene, I'm not safe." Her voice, as well as the look on her face, had a beseeching earnestness that made Irene vaguely uncomfortable. She said, "I don't believe it. In the first place, what you're saying is so utterly, so wickedly wrong. And as for your giving up things—" She stopped, at a loss for an acceptable term to express her opinion of Clare's having nature. But Clare Kendry had begun to cry, audibly, with no effort at restraint, and for no reason that Irene could discover. End of Chapter 4. End of Part 2.